Hey everyone, welcome back to the iGaming experience. I'm your host Sam Batty here in the Zebra Studios in beautiful Podgorica, Montenegro, as usual. And today's episode is going to be a bit different. It's one I've been meaning to do for a while now, actually. I've gotten a few questions, a couple of messages from people who were new to iGaming, and also a couple of people, well, one in particular that's trying to level up. And they have all asked me the same question in somewhat different ways, which is basically how do I learn about the iGaming industry? Where do I get my information from? Who do I listen to? Right? What's worth their time to consume and what's just noise? Obviously, outside of the iGaming experience, where are you going to get valuable information? So today, I am going to walk you through the resources that I personally use to stay sharp in iGaming. So I'll list off a few podcasts, a couple of newsletters, and some related communities, a couple of platforms that I use regularly, and also toss in a little bit of networking advice along the way, right? Because that's a major component of getting information is resources, and human beings are fantastic resources. Okay, so I'll give you a list here of all the things that I visit regularly. It's not an exhaustive list, and it's definitely not academic. Okay, there is no degree in iGaming. So what I'm going to give you here is just what I actually use. Right. And if I were starting again today, knowing what I know now, this is exactly where I would focus on consuming these other resources, along with, of course, this podcast. So let's start with podcasts because for me those are the big ones. That's what I consume the most, and is where a lot of my high level understanding comes from. That's not directly from my job. And what I really like about podcasts, not just in iGaming, but just podcasts in general, um, is you get usually depending on the form, if it's long enough and if the hosts are sincere enough, you get some really good context, you get some nuance and some opinions and sometimes even some respectful disagreements, which really help me shape how I think about these same issues, right? And hearing experts and people with experience or even people that are just curious about it, asking questions and learning is always beneficial to me. And the whole nature of this podcast is learning and leveling up, and in an industry as complex as iGaming, it's just critical. I think unless you're really really lucky and I don't know, uh, people just like you and want to promote you and give you more money, then great. But at a certain point, at least in my experience, I'm a pretty likable guy, but at the same time, you got to come with the goods, or people aren't going to want you around, right? So let's start off with what I think is the most important podcast right now in the industry. This one's top of my list. It's Next.io, which when I first came into the industry, it was called iGaming Next. But I think through a partnership with the YOLO Group, they rebranded. They bought the Next.io domain name, which is very on brand for Tim Heath, who owns YOLO Group. And But Tim Heath didn't start it. It was actually started by a gentleman named Pierre Lind, who I believe is Swedish, and very cool guy, by the way. I've had a lot of chances to meet Pierre at different summits, and he meets a lot of people. And at this stage, he knows who I am, but he's actually pretty good every time about making me feel like I'm important and not wasting his time. And he's usually quite generous about spending a few minutes and catching up. So cool guy. But what's super impressive is his background wasn't, as far as I know, wasn't really in iGaming. He was an event promoter. So he put on these giant events in different parts of Europe or maybe other places in the world. And in fact, I'll come back to that later in the podcast when I talk about other resources I use, because Pierre's event planning skills certainly are relatable to other things that Next.io puts out. So it's a fantastic show. Uh, you, you get a lot of business knowledge. So if you're interested in the iGaming industry itself and stock prices and what different companies are doing and mergers and major hires by the tier ones in our industry, then this is a really good one. I would say Pierre and his he's not the only host. There's several hosts of this podcast have pretty specialized knowledge when it comes to the finance side of things, along with just general iGaming insights. So definitely a valuable listen, and very, very difficult to come across any of this information by online resources, by Googling it, or even on the job. You kind of have to be invited into the room to hear some of these conversations from some of these people. So some real heavy hitters on there, and definitely worth checking out. Definitely worth checking out Next.io. And now Next.io has properly leveled up. So it's not just a podcast, it's actually a proper media company now. Their content is solid, the guests are legit, it's got a balanced tone. It's not hypey, it's not negative, it's just good, thoughtful conversation. Um, and then on top of that, right, you've got the podcast. They also have a newsletter. They do summits as well. So the Next.io summit, by the way, are hands down my favorite industry event. They're smaller usually. They're a lot more interactive. There's sporting events. In fact, little aside, I was on the team that won the golf tournament a couple of years ago, and I'm not being falsely humble when I say that my teammates absolutely carried me, but they did, and yeah, we wound up winning it one of the years. But outside of that, right, it's just good fun. Like, you really make legit connections, right? You're not just collecting business cards. You're really getting to network and spend time with these people and have real conversations. So some of my better friends in the industry have come from these Next.io summits. So definitely worth checking out. Okay, next on my list is the other. I don't know which one is bigger as far as listenership goes, but I imagine this one's pretty massive as well. This one's iGaming Daily, put on by SBC. So SBC Media is one of the biggest companies in all of iGaming, or at least one of the best known. This particular podcast is hosted by Charlie Horner. This British guy who is, or he's from the UK. I don't know exactly where in the UK he's from, but I believe he's the media manager at SBC, and he'll often have a couple of other hosts with him, which is one of the keys to what makes this podcast a good listen. Outside of the information that you get, they just have really good chemistry. Right? You can tell that Charlie and the people that he brings on, they actually understand the industry from a very deep level. They're not just reading headlines and regurgitating it. These guys are getting their hands dirty. They're in the trenches, and then they're coming out and sharing their insights. It's very current, it's relevant, and it keeps you up to date without it being overwhelming. Right. So on this one, I would say you get, similar to Next.io, you get more of the industry as a whole, as to what's happening in the industry, what companies are making major moves. But at the same time, you also get high level individuals that'll come on and just drop some knowledge, teach you a thing or two about what they're doing. And SBC, by the way, is just 100% a company to know. Not just because of these shows, but I think probably what they're best known for in the industry is putting on massive summits, right? Which are, for me, for the large summits, the best one that I go to regularly is SBC Lisbon. It's only been there a couple of years now, but since ICE moved out of London to Barcelona, I have really enjoyed the big summits in Lisbon with SBC. They it's well organized. The venue is fantastic. I've been to a few SBCs in different parts of the world, and it's always the same thing that you're never confused. You know where to go. You know when things are happening. The network events are accessible. Um, just a solid company, and certainly one to be aware of. And in fact, I'm about to make you even more aware of it because that's not the only podcast they put out. They put out another one, which is actually super fun. And I know it's an iGaming podcast. How can they be fun? But this one's called the iGaming Accent, and it has a very different vibe um, than their other podcasts. So this one often focuses on having very experienced guests come on and specifically talking about their career journeys. So they'll give leadership lessons or dive into like specific areas of the industry and get pretty granular, pretty specialized. So if you like hearing about how successful people in iGaming actually built their careers, right? Not just the tools that they use, but the actual journey that they went on and how they leveled up from spot to spot, um, then iGaming Action is a fantastic listen. So definitely recommend that. Um, okay, this one now, the last one I'll say from SBC is on the surface, I think something that a lot of people, unless they were focused on LATAM, right, Latin America and those markets, they would give this a few minutes and then listen to something else or not continue on because it's tends to be quite specialized. However, this is one of my personal favorites, right? SBC Noticias. So this one, as I just said, it focuses heavily on Latin America. Um, But even if LATAM isn't your main market, it's really still worth listening. The hosts are extremely passionate. I don't know their names. I should have it down here. But they're very knowledgeable and especially strong on the regulatory side. So they've really educated me on how things work in Brazil and Argentina. They do a great job of explaining what's happening in those countries and in the neighboring countries and why it matters. They're really good at giving the context, even outside of iGaming. They'll give you some history of their country and the leaders of their nations and the political parties that are involved and how that could potentially shape um, the way that iGaming is treated in that region. So it's fascinating. They drop a lot of knowledge. And you know what? It goes even beyond that. Sometimes it gets quite technical, and they'll talk about really specific skills like SEO. There's some great episodes breaking down search engine optimization. I think one of the hosts there, God, I wish I knew her name. I should look it up. Maybe I'll put it in the show notes. She's very knowledgeable on search engine optimization and SERPs and getting traffic to your site. But they also drop knowledge on gamification and on product. Uh, and while most of the time they are speaking about LATAM, it's honestly it's it they give you information that's applicable to other parts of the industry. But I think it's also a great example of regional content done properly, right? Giving you real insights into the region that you're trying to be doing business in. All right, so SBC Noticias, worth checking out. Another very good one. Really love this one. It's called the iGaming Leader. Right? It's hosted by Leo Judkins, and this is a really good one if you want insights from very senior people. Right, so he gets on the C-level executives and the founders and industry pioneers, longtime operators, and really gets them to open up and share about their successes or maybe something specific that happened in their career. And it's good insights on that side. But what I also like about the podcast is it's not just about business. There's a very strong focus on your life and improving your life in general, like leadership and mindset and just general life skills. So it's one of those podcasts where you went into it for one thing, and then you wind up coming away with that thing and probably one or two other things that you didn't expect to be part of the package. So I think it's a very valuable one. Definitely worth a subscribe. The iGaming Leader with Leo Judkins. Definitely check it out. Okay. Let's talk about a podcast called iGaming Pulse. I'm going to be honest. It's a bit weird. It is. It's a fully scripted conversation between two people, and I'm going to put people in quotes. And it's presented like a real discussion, but I'm not sure if they're real people or if they're AI. Honestly, it sounds good. They don't stumble over a word. They bounce off of each other perfectly. But it's a bit weird. It's a bit weird it's a bit jarring the way that it's so scripted. However, with that hate out of the way, I have to admit the content itself is actually useful. Right? This might be stuff that you could just get if you were putting in the right prompt in ChatGPT, but you know what? They're doing some of that work for you and presenting it. They explained fundamentals pretty well. So if you're a beginner to early intermediate level, I would say this podcast is actually not a bad way to test your understanding. So, if you listen to an episode and you don't finish thinking, yeah, obviously I knew all that, then you still need to lock down the basics and you're probably going to get some value out of it. It's put out by a company called Casino Rank, which I'll mention again later. But an interesting one, because like I said, it's weird, it's a little bit jarring, and maybe it's the future of content. I don't know, but yeah, you could still get some value out of it. Right. And I guess while I'm talking about these, very similar to that, there's another one called the name is hilarious, especially because my mom's from India, so it's called Spice Up Your Game, and it focuses on the Indian market. So I'm not offended by it at all. It does make me laugh. Spice up your game. Again, I'm pretty sure it's AI, which is again not my favorite presentation style, but again, the information is actually decent. It's pretty solid. So if you're interested in India or emerging markets, there's actually value there. I've actually got a little bit of insights from that podcast that I've used in my day to day. Quite frankly, I've not fully worked on a brand that's dove into the Indian market, but I've been at the start of launches for a couple of brands that have. So I've had to get versed in it, and spice up your game, man. Check it out. All right, and then on the podcast, that's kind of it for the iGaming specific ones. But I do want to mention one other one. There was a series in 2022 called The Gamblers. It's not, as I said, specific to iGaming, but it's very well produced. It's incredibly entertaining, and it offers great insights into a bunch of betting markets and strategies and psychology. So if you want to get inside the mind of a punter, of a bettor, of someone people who found loopholes or had great success, then definitely worth a listen. I would say it's certainly less educational in the traditional sense, where you're just getting information thrown at you. But it does give you some context and some perspective, which matters more than most people would realize, I would say. All right. So, like I said, that's it for podcasts. Podcasts are great. And I am listening to them daily, but one of the more concrete ways that I stay up to date on what's happening in the industry is with newsletters and communities, right? Online communities. So those are really how I stay very day to day, more real time. So let's go back to Next.io. right? So I mentioned Next.io has the podcast and has the summits. I don't know if I mentioned this though, but they have. Did I mention this? Probably not. They have a great newsletter as well. So the newsletter hits the inbox. I can just scan it. Anything interesting comes up, I give it a click, read the article. However, I tend to not dive that deep into the Next.io newsletter because they also have a Telegram group, and the Telegram group just posts news articles. And so pretty much everything that shows up in that newsletter also gets posted on Telegram. Quite honestly, I keep that channel muted, so I'm not getting pinged all the time. But once or twice a day, I will give it a look. So the Telegram group is a news feed, but then they also have multiple WhatsApp chats, all right, WhatsApp groups, and there's a general one where, to be honest, it's kind of a few loud voices that are interesting, cool people in the industry actually, but it's a few folks that'll be uh, in there and quite vocal and sort of keeping the conversation going. And then when it gets close to summit time, Next.io will open WhatsApp groups specifically for those summits to discuss what's going on there. People discuss, what networking events are happening, where's the party at. And I think it's just a good way to keep a vibe on what's happening and what people are talking about. And yeah, every now and then I get clued up to a cool event or a cool party that I want to attend. So if you attend any of these events at all, then those groups are absolute gold. Like they really do clue you up to some things that you probably wouldn't learn about, right? And they're fun. They're curated by admins, and so you get some real discussion with some real people and sometimes some real insights. So worth checking that out. On the newsletter front as well, very good one. In fact, one that I kind of think of more as like a catch-all, where I expect any of the major news is going to be on here. And this is from a company called IGB, which I believe just stands for iGaming Business. So, like I said, it's more traditional industry news, but that's not a bad thing. It's very good for staying grounded and learning what's actually happening. And some of the articles that they have will break down pretty granularly what they're talking about. So it gives you a lot of the background context as well. So if you don't know anything about the companies, I find that they're pretty good at linking to things that they give you the background. All right. So another newsletter that I subscribe to on LinkedIn is called The Gamblist. Right. I use it more for a quick hit. So when I'm going through LinkedIn every now and then, I'll just give it a peek and see what the latest is. And every now and then it'll show me something that I've not seen in one of my other feeds. So not one of my main info sources, but it is certainly one of them. And speaking of LinkedIn, this is a big one, a little bit of a cliche, but you got to get into it. Right? I know a lot of people groan when LinkedIn comes up, but let me be very clear. If you are serious about leveling up in iGaming, LinkedIn is not optional. Okay. Unless you're coming with bags of money and you don't need anyone else to open doors for you, you're going to need to be on there. Right? Everyone who's doing interesting things in this industry is there. Right? You've got founders and CEOs and CTOs and CMOs, product leaders, regulators and affiliates. Like everyone's on there, all of them. So get into it. I'm not saying you have to post every day. I don't. I probably should. In fact, that's something I'm thinking about doing. But I'm kind of have enough traffic coming at me as it is. But if you're trying to level up and it's appropriate for you, then you should think about getting on there and posting. But here's how I recommend using LinkedIn, at least initially, is number one, I think this is obvious, but follow industry leaders and companies that you find interesting. Right? So do a little bit of research and, companies that you've been exposed to or just think their website is cool, and see who the founder is, or look up some articles from the resources I've already mentioned in this podcast, and you'll hear some names. Look them up, find them on LinkedIn. And now here's the more delicate part. Okay, so you find these people, you're following them, and I know we all want to do this. We want to connect, right? You want to get in the DMs. You want to have a personal hookup. But I would not recommend initially sending out a bunch of connection requests, right, to these people that you don't know. Connect with people you actually know. Let's start with that at first. People who are going to see your name and your picture and be like, oh yeah, I know that guy. Accept it. Okay. Once you build up a little pool of that, right, within your industry, and these people don't have to be your best friends, by the way. These can just be people that you know, that you've worked with, and you can send them a little note to say, hey, I'd like to connect on LinkedIn. I'm looking to expand my network. Most people are pretty cool about that, especially if they already know you. Then when you get connected with people, look at who they're connected to, and then ask for an intro, right? Don't just jump onto their list. Ask, say, hey, this person looks interesting. I would like 5 to 10 minutes of their time. Would you mind introducing me to them? Again, usually people are pretty cool about that, right? Now, I said don't spam connect with all the different leaders that you've heard of. However, that doesn't mean always, right? I do think that you should connect with people that you admire, but, and this is a big one, do it properly, right? So when you reach out, there's no generic messages. First of all, no chat GPT. You're writing this, okay? And you're not writing some huge essay. We don't need your life story, right? You need like 4 to 5 lines for real, okay? You need one line, who you are, right? Another line, how you found them, right? How did they come up on your radar? Number 3, why do they interest you, right? What are you reaching out for? And related to that, the last thing is what you're trying to achieve, right? So I'll give you an example. I would say something like, hi, so-and-so, my name is Sam. I'm new to iGaming, or I'm trying to level up in this area of iGaming. I came across your talk or your podcast or some achievement that you've had, and it really stood out to me. My goal here is to achieve X, and I think a brief exchange or a virtual coffee with you would set me on the right path. And that's it. In fact, I did exactly what I just described about a week and a half ago with someone who I won't name here, but a real heavy hitter in the industry, a founder of one of the most successful companies in iGaming. He was a guest on a podcast, one of the podcasts above that I just listed earlier. And I found him interesting. I thought that we had maybe 1 or 2 things in common. So I reached out to him on LinkedIn and said pretty much exactly what I just wrote there. 4 points. Hey, I heard you on this podcast. You seem pretty cool. I have this and this in common with you. So I listed a couple of things. I said, I think I'm also an interesting person. I would love to have a virtual coffee with you at some point. And he got back to me within 24 hours and said, hey, I love virtual coffees. Let's do it. And so we booked a call for early next year. So that's one lesson is how to reach out. And I would also say, you might be surprised at how forthcoming some people are that you might think wouldn't have the time for you, right? A lot of these very successful people, you'd be surprised how rarely they're asked for advice or for mentorship. And so if you come at them with good reasons, and this is a big one, this is a huge one, you're not giving them work to do, right? You're not reaching out and saying, hey, I have all these skills. If there's anything I could do to help you, let me know. Well, now you're giving him work. He's got him or her has to think, okay, how do those skills apply to my my business or the things I'm trying to achieve, and then how do I fold this person into it? No, none of that, right? Let's keep it simple, crack the door open. And in fact, I think I've alluded to it. I've got a couple of future podcasts coming up that are going to be very specific to networking, and I'll break this down in very fine detail, because this is actually one of the things that I think that I am fortunate to do fairly well, and it's something that somewhat organically came up. I didn't set out to be, good at networking or good at reaching out to people, but I just naturally got some encouragement. I did a few things right, and now I've actually looked into it properly and seen the right things to do. So coming up, I will hook you up eventually, but for now, let's finish what we're talking about here, which is the resources I currently use. So getting close to the end here, but there are a couple of websites that I'm not hitting up every day, but I find myself coming back to pretty regularly. One of them will surprise people if you're in this industry, I think, uh, because it's a company called SumSub. Their website comes up surprisingly often when I'm searching for explanations around compliance and anti-money laundering, and of course, KYC. In fact, I should say, if you don't know who SumSub is a company that has a tool for automated KYC, which stands for Know Your Customer. So that's the process customers have to go through to prove that they are who they say they are. And so they're quite good about explaining fairly complex topics in a blog post type of way. They don't go too deep into it, but deep enough that you get enough knowledge to understand and to be able to speak about it intelligently. So yeah, shout out SumSub. They actually have a pretty dope product as well. I really like. I've integrated SumSub on several projects I've worked on, and it's great. It's a nice seamless product. All right, another actually, company I guess with a similar rep as far as having a killer product is Soft Swiss. Right. So if you've not heard of Soft Swiss, you need to. They are one of the major heavy hitters in the industry. They have a rock solid platform. At least that's the reputation. That their technology is absolutely solid. That they've got affiliate technology. They have casino aggregation tech. They're basically a one-stop shop. And my experience is they are so good and so successful that you really have to come correct if you want to work with them. So it's not about you just meeting their costs. No, you need to show them A, that you're going to meet their costs, B, that you've got enough of a budget to make your brand successful, right? So that you're worth their time, and C, that you've got a team that knows what they're doing. They will check all these things for real, and you're not getting a second. Yeah, you're not even going to get a demo if you can't prove that you've got all of those things, all your ducks in a row, right? But the reason I mentioned Soft Swiss is because they publish an annual marketing report and a forecast for the industry that is genuinely worth reading. It's quite long. I forget how long the most recent one is maybe 70 or 80 pages or something. But a lot of the stuff that's in that Soft Swiss report is what you hear people talking about throughout the year. So when numbers are being quoted or trends are being talked about, especially in the second quarter of the year, you're going to have people basically, if they're dialed into this industry, you're going to hear them quoting stuff out of the Soft Swiss report. They put a lot of money into it. You could tell it's beautifully designed, and there's a ton of data in there. So definitely get the Soft Swiss annual marketing report, right? In industry forecast. I think they put out a couple more throughout the year, smaller ones, but you definitely want that big one. Okay. And this has nothing to do with using their tech. These are just insights into the industry. They're very, very solid. Okay. And that's it. And that's pretty much it. Those are the resources I use. external to colleagues, by the way. I guess I could have used that as a section here. I've mentioned it many times. But the best way to learn about iGaming is through actually working in the industry. And there are people with varying levels of experience, some with 5, 10, 20, getting on. I don't think I've met anyone with this much because the industry is fairly new, but 25 years. And you're going to get some invaluable information there that, again, just doesn't exist anywhere else except in that person's head and maybe a few of their contemporaries. So definitely like lean into your colleagues as well. But outside of colleagues, as I said, I use podcasts all the time, constantly rocking them. Newsletters, they're free. Check them out. I get in these different communities. I'm mainly a lurker there, but every now and then I'll have something to say or a comment, or I'll react to something with a thumbs up. And then LinkedIn, get on LinkedIn and start expanding that network. And like I said, I will break down in the future episodes specifically some LinkedIn techniques and some other networking techniques that will help you to grow your network in a genuine way, right? Where you're actually keeping it real and everybody's winning. Okay. All right, and that's it. I guess last bit of advice I would say, if you're new to iGaming, might not be the best move to try and consume everything at once. I would say give all these guys like a little taste and take some of my advice or my description here and pick a few, right? Pick 3 or 4 of these podcasts, give them a few listens, and then, see if you want to expand it and more of your time and take on some of these other ones. Right. And then I would say with the newsletters, I would say pick 1 or 2. Otherwise, if you're getting 4 or 5 or 6, you're just going to wind up ignoring. So just get a couple that are good and actually look at them when they land in your inbox. Right. And, as I said, get active on LinkedIn. And, and most importantly, right, this is what I really should be saying. Stay curious. Right. This is really, I've listed off all these resources, but there could be a new one that's just popped up today. Right. I mean, this podcast has only been around for a few months. Most people in the industry have never heard of it. And it'll probably stay that way for a while because, like I said, I'm not even, or maybe forever, because the point of this is not really to promote it. The point of it is to educate you, the listener, and for me to strengthen my own knowledge by sharing and researching. So this is one of these win-wins that I'm always looking for, and I feel like this podcast is achieving it. But I digress. My point here was to stay curious, right? So keep looking for these new resources. And if you find some that I've not mentioned, especially if it's a whole other category, then hook me up, right? I didn't mention there's a couple of online courses out there. I don't think they're really worth your time. But they do exist. So, you can find a couple out there. I'm not going to name any of them, but I've taken a couple. I've taken 3 iGaming courses online, and I might have learned 1 or 2 things, but for the most part, they were things that were Googleable, for the most part. So, I would stick with the ones that I had mentioned, but also clue me in, because as I always say, I am very much here to learn as well. So hook me up. Let's make it a win-win going both ways. All right. This industry rewards people who genuinely want to understand how things work. Okay. Not just people chasing the next trend. And that's where the curiosity comes in. You really want to know what unlocks a player experience, what unlocks profit for the operator, what unlocks a viral game, right? It's about staying curious. It's about keeping your eyes open and your ears open, and just taking in the information from all these different interesting people that make up this wacky iGaming industry. Yeah, it's fun. Really is fun. Okay, that's it. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the iGaming Experience. Again, I'm your host, Sam Batty, here in the Zebra Studios in beautiful Podgorica, Montenegro. If you have any questions or comments, if you found this podcast, you could probably figure out how to send them to me. My email is sam@zebrasolutions.me. So welcome to hit me up there. I've actually had a couple of people taking me up on that recently, and I appreciate it. I like the conversation. So I look forward to hearing from you. And if not, I will catch you in the next episode. Cheers.